I would like to see a shift in our cultural and particularly the culture within academia, our attitudes toward, issues of social justice to where we say things like, yeah, I believe that there are issues regarding sex, race, sexuality, gender, etc. And I think that they're important, but I want to see them studied rigorously. I don't want gender theory informing me of this. I don't want the constant complaining. I want to see real work being done, and I want to see sociological rigor behind things before we use it to make policy decisions or institutionalize anything. And if you're going to bully me by saying to check my privilege, I don't have to listen to you, and have a good day.
So anyway, Jim, why don't we start off with you giving us a background of yourself and your life before the hoax academic papers experiment.
Okay, that's a complicated thing to do as it is, but I'll try to keep it short. So I originally went to college, we'll go back that far, to study physics. And near the middle of my senior year, end of my junior year, somewhere in there, I realized, oh my God, I hate physics. And I don't want to do it, but I have to finish this degree because I really don't want to, change majors at the end of my college career and stick around as an undergrad for 2 or 3 extra years. I don't even know what I want to study otherwise. So I finished my physics degree. Through a variety of decisions, I ended up in a master's of mathematics program. Well, actually, it's a master's of science in mathematics program. I did that in a couple of years, and then I left and got a PhD in math in 2010. From there, I left the academy almost immediately due to the varieties and demands of life. And I missed teaching right away. I didn't miss grading. I didn't miss having to deal with an increasing email demand from my students, which had gotten just untenable the last couple of years I was there. But mostly I missed the thing at first, and I got into a variety of, I got a job, and then to keep myself academically entertained, I got into a variety of different fields of study and just started studying them on my own. So that would be philosophy of science, philosophy of religion in particular. I get very interested in the questions and the debates that were going on about religion in the early 2010s. And then that switched into me really wanting to understand what was going on there. So I started to study the psychology of religion and moral psychology to try to understand why people form groups that behave the way religions behave. And that really occupied most of my time from maybe early 2013 until 2016, going into 17. And that included also the psychology of authoritarianism. So that would be kind of the stuff that I was interested in, and I was writing what I thought were contemporary essays, sometimes in relatively decent publications like Time Magazine and Scientific American, sometimes just on a blog, and some stuff in between. Contribute chapters to books, wrote a few of my own, and that's what I was doing up until Peter Boghossian and I decided it was time to try to hoax gender studies.
So how did you and Peter Boghossian connect in the first place?
Okay, so we actually connected in the first place on Twitter, of all places. I think that's actually kind of common now, but we connected on Twitter. There were two things going on at once. I had written an essay regarding something to do with Sam Harris. I don't even remember what the essay was now, but I was defending Sam Harris or elaborating on some opinion he had or something like this. And Peter saw it and thought it was great. And he reached out to me and said that he liked my writing, he liked what I was doing, and he kind of had two requests. One was, do you want to consider writing together some in the future, maybe a potential future essay or two? And then also, would you mind reading my book, or his book at the time that he was just finishing, which was a manual for creating atheists, and giving my opinion and maybe writing a review if I thought it was worth it and all of that. And I agreed to both. And I guess he liked the way I wrote the review or something. We ended up writing a number of articles together for a number of years. lots of stuff together. Actually, we work together pretty seamlessly. We have a overlapping set of talents and deficits that works out to where we become something better than both of ourselves when we work together. So it went pretty well for a number of years doing that. And so that's how we originally connected. And then we got into the whole thing about grievance studies as kind of just a natural evolution of that work after keeping an eye on Real Peer Review, their Twitter feed, and keeping an eye on stuff that was coming out.
What is Real Peer
Oh,
Review?
so there's a Twitter account. It's now called the New Real Peer Review. It used to just be Real Peer Review. That goes through, it's a group of people, I think, that are mostly scientists, and they actually scour the literature for ridiculous papers that have passed peer review. Sometimes they're papers in journals, sometimes they're an academic thesis, sometimes it's a book. Usually it's something at paper length. And they read them and they highlight excerpts from the papers and kind of make fun of the papers, really. I was going to say that they had commentary, but they really just kind of make fun of them. And it's really a shocking insight into how many papers, and in certain veins of literature and in certain journals in specific, are just really something to be concerned about, that are almost, as people say, beyond parody, or they're examples of Poe's law where you can't tell the difference between reality and parody anymore. And so following that, and then this kind of a thing about this paper about feminist glaciology, trying to change the science of glaciology to fit with feminism, and it got a ton of attention, and it got highlighted on Real Peer Review, and people were writing articles about it, swearing it must be a hoax. Peter and I said, well, if they can't tell the difference, why don't we try one? And so that's how we ended up embarking on the project that's now come to be known as the Grievance Studies Affair.
And and you guys also hooked up with Helen Pluckrose?
Yeah,
How did she get involved?
So Peter and I originally set up, and we wrote a really, really bad one that's really funny called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. And that ended up getting into a journal that I'm not allowed to say it's predatory, and we'll leave it at that. It's a journal that seems to have severe deficits in its peer review standards and will publish papers for money, but I didn't call it predatory because of reasons. So that muddied the water. It got into a journal that that wasn't sufficiently good for us to draw any conclusions from, although that created a bit of a debate about whether or not it did. That was in May of 2017. And so there were people arguing that, yeah, the fact that it is a perfect parody of what you see coming in real papers says something. And then there were people saying, no, it's a terrible journal, so we can't conclude anything. And a couple of people, one being Alan Sokol, after whom our project was also named, the Sokol Squared is another name that it's sometimes given. Alan Sokol wrote a hoax on a postmodern cultural criticism journal in 1996. And we kind of followed in his footsteps. So Alan Sokol laid out some parameters and said that we had partial success, but mostly failure. And had we done other things, we would have had more success. And then a couple of people who are pretty severe critics of us wrote similar articles that indicated that had we done X, Y, Z, and W, then we would have had something convincing, but that's not what we did. So over the summer of 2017, Peter and I decided that we would take those criticisms seriously, and starting with X, Y, Z, and W, we would set forth new rules and start another attempt at this. And we were going to do it big, and we were going to do as many as we could. We originally planned to write papers for 1 year and write as many of them as we could, see through until they were all either accepted or finally defeated, and then report on the results, whatever they were. And pretty early on, we realized we needed somebody to help us understand theory, to catch glaring errors that we were making, to help us understand what was going on. And so my other friend and collaborator, Helen Pluckrose, is actually really, really, really well versed in this. She's very, very smart. And so we turned to her and asked her if she would help us in that regard. So she became kind of, at that point, That was early September, so we'd only been at it a few weeks of 2017. She started becoming kind of my theory tutor, like gender theory, queer theory, critical race theory. She was like my tutor for that. She would read our papers and say, "Oh, here's where, somebody will say this is wrong, or this doesn't line up with the way they think, or whatever." And she coached us like that and helped us write what were just brazen and idiotic hoaxes. And that continued until November. And when Thanksgiving hit, we got a rejected paper that was rejected for all the right reasons. It was
this kind of the first round that you guys did, or are you talking about the
so yeah,
full
it gets a
hoax?
little complicated. So the conceptual penis was like this first foray into the thing Peter and I did, and then that ended, and then we decided to do the big project that is now called the Grievance Studies Affair. The conceptual penis was technically not part of that. That we separated into three different phases of sophistication. And so what I've described so far was the first phase, where we were writing actual hoax papers, and then we learned the hard way that that wasn't going to work. You can't hoax these people. What they're doing from the inside makes sense, and they know what they're talking about from the inside, and they understand it. They know what it looks like. They know what the scholarship says, and they take it quite seriously. So in November, we turned to Helen again and said, "Helen, we have to up our level. We need to," as we were using the phrase, "situate this in their literature. You know their literature best of all of us. Time to upgrade." She was no longer our tutor and consultant. She became, a conspirator full on at that point. And so we started doing that. Our second phase papers would have been that kind, where we would situate things in the literature, then write crazy stuff. The dog park paper is an example of this. And then do whatever it took to make it work. Later, probably February or March, we got sophisticated enough where we actually had learned what we were talking about. And it became very difficult to write those just asinine papers anymore. And we actually just started writing real papers within the discipline that made ludicrous and absurd claims or used broken ethics. So we kind of had three phases of sophistication: outright hoaxing, which didn't work; this kind of like blended, we know what we're talking about, but we're being absurd, and then we can just do this now, as three distinct phases. So it got a little complicated there.
So ultimately, what were you guys looking to prove by doing this?
Yeah, so we wanted, at first, when we thought we were hoaxing, what we wanted to show was that the reviewers would not be able to distinguish absolute nonsense, demonstrable nonsense, from the legitimate article of whatever they're publishing. That we figured out they can distinguish, that they can tell the difference. They can do it reliably. They can do it well. I can do it well now. So there is something to learn there. The second phase after that, in the third phase, we were actually trying to learn, okay, we can't trick them. So let's figure out what they're actually doing. Let's understand it on their terms. They have a term for this they call outsider within. Let's become outsiders within, where we are people who don't buy into the ideology or the lines of thought or the theoretical lenses or any of this that lead to this scholarship. But we can operate within that paradigm as though we are. And then we will use that to launch legitimate criticism that's very difficult not to take seriously. We'll also try to make the papers funny and ridiculous to draw lots of attention to the problem that we're trying to highlight. And in some cases, therefore, we used papers that no serious scientist would take seriously, like the data in the dog park paper is just asinine, and it's red flags all over the place, but instead of recognizing that, they accepted, published, and honored the paper for excellence. And we used just horrifying ethics and things like this to make it clear that, there really is a problem here.
And you targeted specifically the social sciences and humanities?
So mostly the humanities, but there's this weird place that we called Grievance Studies that is a sector of the humanities Now, part of the social sciences has been corrupted by it, but we didn't actually, we did target that, but we didn't succeed in getting any papers into actual sociology or psychology journals. But there's this sector within the humanities that build itself, if you really wanted to collect them under a bland title, it would be cultural studies, that at some point over the past 5 decades has decided, or gradually over the past 5 decades, has decided that rather than doing humanities in the sense that the humanities are meant to be, which is to understand what's there within human pursuits like art and literature and even philosophy, and then to expand upon that and develop it, that they turn to this kind of particular criticism that looks at things in very specific ways, which is essentially to do what is called close readings, for example, and find hidden power dynamics and problems with everything to make oppression or marginalization or these power dynamics or any other problem they can imagine more visible. And they infused it intentionally with a political project and try to pretend it's basically people within the humanities that are political activists who are trying to pretend that they're social scientists. And for whatever reason, the academic system has let this niche pass. It has let this go on. And you have to be so careful talking about this because you want to say they didn't put a stop to it. But then everybody says, aha, you want to put a stop to it. You want to be an authoritarian and shut down academic freedom. That's not right. When we say put a stop to it in that context, what we mean is they didn't apply rigorous review and say what you guys are, or didn't demand rigorous review and say what's going on here is actually not legitimate. It's not passing the necessary rigor that it needs to draw the conclusions that it's drawing. So if you want to make a sociological conclusion, you should use sociological rigor. You should have statistics involved. You should be very precise with this. You shouldn't be able to just start with your opinion and write a bunch of garbage and then come out the other end and say my opinion is true, which is how I wrote, or how the three of us wrote every one of our papers.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask, because you said something along the lines of you guys had an underlying question for every paper you wrote, which was, what do we have to say and who do we need to cite in order to be published as high scholarship? So essentially,
Correct.
that's doing what I imagine should be the opposite for an academic research paper. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So if you want to do serious scholarship, you can't start with your conclusion in mind and then work your way to it. That's cheating. You can start with a hypothesis. You can believe you know what the conclusion might be. That's fine. You can say, oh, I think that the world works this particular way. Let's have a look. But ultimately, the evidence has to lead you where it's going to. And so if the evidence says that your hypothesis was wrong, that's okay. That's just fine. So now you say, oh, well, there's a phenomenon and we had a hypothesis and it's not that. So let's put forth another hypothesis. But that's not what's happening in these fields. They start with, or at least not with our papers. With our papers, so we started with the opinion that we wanted to forward, or the crazy idea we wanted to see in print in a scholarly journal. And then we figured out ways to make it work, to make them publish it and consider it to be legitimate. And it was easy because they're not relying upon the rigor that they should be to draw the conclusions they draw. And they have easily copied and exploitable biases. When you tell them the things they want to hear, they think, oh, this is good. And if you tell them things they don't want to hear, they say this is bad. And rather than checking rigor and methods and everything like that, the primary thing they're looking for is, does this conform to the view of the world that I wish is true? And it's just not sufficient for a real study.
So can you before we jump more into what you guys did, can you give us an overview of just what the process is to submit an academic paper and to try and get it published in a journal?
Yeah, this is not like submitting an essay to a magazine or to an online thing or even a newspaper or journal or anything like that. This is a very serious business. This is the thing that academics build their careers off of. And for This doesn't apply in some of the sciences where there's a lot of collaboration and different things, but in many disciplines, particularly in the humanities, you might see one to two, maybe three papers per year from a very diligent researcher. They take a lot of work to do the background research and work on. They should take months of effort in that regard, reading, thinking, experimenting, checking, testing, writing it up, revising, the whole thing. That should take months to produce one of these documents, maybe at the length of, depending on what's going on, anywhere between 4 and 10,000 words is kind of a middle of the road ballpark figure. Then you will submit the paper to an academic journal. The editor of that journal or a sub-editor will read it and decide whether or not it's suitable for what the journal tends to publish and has superficially enough rigor to consider further. The editors are not taken as the expert readers who will decide at this point whether or not the paper has scholarly merit. They just want to make sure it meets the basic requirements and it's within the scope of what the journal says. Then they send it off to what are called peer reviewers. Peer reviewers, the number of those will be anywhere. Sometimes it's one, but there's usually at least two, and it may be as many as 4 or 5. All of our papers had 2, 3, or 4. So they send it off to peer review. Peer reviewers are experts in the field who are ideally people who have specific expertise in the things that the paper is about. Often there'll be people who are cited in the paper, for example. And it's their job to read the paper, to point out where it goes wrong, to show where it's weak, to give suggestions, to tell the editor and the author what's good and particularly what's insufficient or bad about the paper, and to give a often long list of revisions and corrections that are necessary before that paper can be considered for publication in a serious journal. The paper then goes back to the author, who is expected to address those comments and make whatever changes are there, or to give really solid reasons for not taking those suggestions if some of them are not taken. Then the paper is resubmitted. The editor, depending on the situation, the editor will either then decide, okay, this is satisfactory, or may send it back to one or more of the peer reviewers or to another round of peer review. And then the whole process may repeat again. It usually doesn't. Usually you get sent to peer review once or twice, and then that's it. And then ultimately the editor makes a decision. That process, so from submission until acceptance, typically takes anywhere between 3 and 6 months, but it can go as long as a year or more. And sometimes it's faster.
So in theory, on average, you're saying it should take several months for an author of these papers to actually research and write the paper, and then another several months for that to even go through the whole peer review process.
Correct. I would estimate that from start to finish, a paper on average should take an academic from the minute they start working on it to the minute that it hits publication. The minimum amount of time that should go by in most cases is going to be somewhere between 6 and 12 months. So it's a slow process.
And you were saying that
we wrote.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we wrote 20 of them in 1 year, for 10 months actually.
So you wrote 20 in 1 year.
Yeah.
When that what you just said, that should be pretty much 1 a year for like a legitimate scholar.
Yeah. So it's a little bit stretching it depending on the scholar, but if you take kind of a middle of the road scholar in the humanities, the three of us essentially recreated their entire academic career in 10 months.
Wow.
The research side of it, I should say, not the teaching and service and, committees and all the other crap that academics do, but the research side.
And didn't you say that essentially came down to 13 days per paper? Yeah,
the way it actually worked out, we had a whole Excel thing and like a graph and all this where it was like this paper was written then and submitted and all this, all this stuff to keep track of everything. And we worked it out that from the first day we started writing the first paper to the last day that we were writing papers, putting in original content before they got sent off the first time. It worked out to one paper every 13 days. That includes papers, by the way, I should say, that we wrote, and we wrote a few papers, and actually there's one that we finished rough draft, one or two that we finished rough drafts of that we never submitted because we decided that they were either too much of a stretch or they weren't going to get anywhere. So those are actually included in that calculation.
Can I ask what those were, the ones that you ultimately didn't end up submitting?
Well, we wanted to take the argument in the dog park paper at the end. It suggests that to
Can
overcome
you
rape culture.
maybe give us a breakdown of that paper?
Sure. So and then I'll get to the conclusion. So in the dog park paper, we claimed that we were a feminist researcher named Helen Wilson who spent 1,000 hours sitting in dog parks in Portland, observing dogs and the human behavior around them. In particular, Helen Wilson was interested in dog humping and dog fights, and she wanted to see when and why people would break up the dog humps, or the humping incidents, as they were phrased, or dog fights. And she wanted to talk about canine rape culture and how it projects onto human rape culture, or vice versa, how human rape culture projects onto canine rape culture, and try to derive conclusions about human rape culture as a result. So she tracked important variables, like she would find out what genders the dogs were by inspecting their genitals. Then she would interrogate the owners as to their genders and sexual orientations. And then she would use that to draw conclusions by seeing that, male straight men that own dogs will break up gay dog fights and dog humping way more often than they break up heterosexual dog rape, and they often encourage heterosexual dog rape. And women
I'm sorry,
break up dog
I have
rape.
to tell you that our executive producer is just losing it right now. He's,
That
he's
happens.
he's laughing so hard. He's losing it now. Sorry, I had to.
I told you they're pretty funny. So yeah. Anyway, to skip that part, we then decided to analyze that through a lens, as we call it, of Black feminist criminology, to draw the conclusion that dog parks are rape condoning spaces and petri dishes of canine rape culture that are essentially out of control, and that the only possible thing to you can conclude from that is that human rape culture is reflected in the way that the humans react to dog humping. And so we should basically train men the way we would train dogs, like leashes and shock collars, but we can't do those literally because it says in the paper that we can't use it literally because it's not politically feasible, as opposed to, ethically horrendous. But anyway, you can't really put a man on a leash, but you can control him by, all of these different methods. And it's kind of like him being on a leash, so that, we can combat rape culture. That was the conclusion. So we wrote another paper that was going to really push that and really suggest which dog training manuals are the best for training men like dogs. And it got written in April of 2007 or 18. So near the end of our writing phase of the project. And when we read through the draft after it was written, it just didn't quite work, and we just couldn't make it go. So
even
we
though
dropped
the first
that
paper
one.
worked so well.
Yeah, it's like the magic just wasn't there. It just didn't work. It dived into biological essentialism too much. It forced the whole dog training manual thing a little too hard. It was just a bit of a reach. There's another one I started that would have worked out just fine. I did all of the background research and drafted up a little bit about it. That was on the gentrification of cornbread and the way that white people are using cornbread and stealing essentially traditional African American foods and then excluding them from them by making them gentrified by putting in ingredients like pumpkin spice flavor or onions or something like that. And then all of a sudden now, black people are excluded from one of their traditional foods, and it just perpetuates racism through food. And so that one probably would have done okay, the gentrified cornbread paper. There were a number of either failed attempts or things that we took to various stages of the process but didn't submit, as it turns out.
So how did you guys, I'm just hearing that dog park example and
Mm-hmm.
it just sounds ridiculous. How did you guys come up with these topics? Like, what was your process?
No, see, now you're all wrong. There's not a process. Well, okay, there's sort of sometimes there's a process, but usually there's not a process. Um, you contemplate, say, feminist or race theory complaining and the way that they complain about things, and then you try to think of things that are ridiculous, and eventually something clicks. Like, okay, let's run with this idea about dog parks. Or I was laying in bed one night and not doing anything. Very important to point out, and it struck me that it'd be hilarious to try to use sexuality theory to explain why straight men don't tend to stick things in their butts. And then it would, I was driving home one day and I drove by Hooters and I thought, a feminist scholar would really have a hard time explaining why that place exists, or a masculinity scholar would have a hard time explaining why that place exists if they pretended they knew nothing about, the way that guys actually are and just tried to come at it from a social construction perspective. So then I wrote a paper about going to Hooters so that men can tell the waitresses what to do and get away with it. That was sort of the process. Helen was more meticulous. Helen would read their scholarship and pick things that were actually, patterns that she saw in the scholarship that she wanted to reproduce or exaggerate. And Peter and I did that a little bit too, but mostly we just thought of what's the most absurd thing that we can think of related to this. So with fat studies, for example, which it does not study obesity, it studies fat acceptance.
So there's fat studies, like that's a real field of study.
Oh yeah, totally. And they say things like that obesity being a health problem is a medicalized narrative. They don't like the word obesity at all. They call that medicalization of a person's life, and say that it's basically a way to impose a power dynamic or shame upon them. And so we thought, what's basically the most absurd thing that you could try to get into fat studies? And we thought, well, fat bodybuilding, where people go on stage and just show off their fat instead of their muscles, and that should be accepted as equally valid. That's pretty absurd. Let's see if they'll take it. And they did. That paper was pretty good.
Was that paper one that was published?
Yeah, in Fat Studies. That's the name of the journal.
So that went through this whole rigorous process that we just broke down and ultimately made it through.
Uh-huh.
And was published.
At one point in that paper, we thought it'd be funny. So you asked what the process was. And a lot of times it's like, what just like little absurdity or cute Easter egg or whatever can we stick in here? So the last section of the fat bodybuilding paper was Peter's a huge sci-fi geek. And so he wanted to put a nod to Star Trek in there. And so we called fat bodybuilding the final frontier for fat activism. And one of the reviewers had a major problem with that and said by calling it the final frontier, we were making two mistakes. The first mistake is that we were saying final, and like there wouldn't still be the need for fat activism if fat bodybuilding took place. And secondly, more importantly, the word frontier reminds us of the genocide of indigenous people, so we need to choose a different word. That's the kind of stuff they're worried about.
Wow.
Like with the dog paper, they were worried about whether or not we inspected the dog's genitals respectfully. How do we protect the dog's privacy and things? And then they were also worried about how we dealt with the fact that we're humans and we're writing about the perspective of a dog. So we should acknowledge that we don't have the same perspective as a dog on life and humping. I'm not kidding.
And you guys, there were two other paper topics that stuck out to me. Wasn't there one where you took parts of Mein Kampf and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that happened. Yeah, chapter 12 of Mein Kampf, where Hitler says what would be demanded of people in his movement, aka the Nazi Party. We rewrote that and took out our movement and put in intersectional feminism. We just rewrote most of the chapter. Hitler lays out a 14-point plan of what it would require of people who want to be part of his movement, and we changed it to an 8-point plan. We combined some of the points, and some of them were just kind of out there, and it was too long anyway. There's often, a maximum word requirement, so we took some of them out. And so we put down an 8-point plan for how intersectional feminism needs to reorganize in order to not fail at its intersectional obligations. And that was accepted by a social work journal.
And then there was another one where you guys talked about how white students in universities shouldn't be allowed to ask questions in class and should be chained to the floors.
Yeah, to experience reparations. So that was based on a paper or a thing that actually happened in the news. There was a teacher at Penn State or University of Pennsylvania. I don't remember. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, one of the two big schools in Pennsylvania. I know her name, but I probably shouldn't name her. So she got some attention, got some headlines in late 2017 for introducing what was called a progressive stack into her classroom. Progressive stacking started in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it was a way where the protesters would organize their meetings so that the people that were deemed the most intersectionally marginalized got the first and largest opportunity to speak. So they basically said, okay, if you're like a black woman, you can talk first. And if you're a white guy, if there's time at the end, you can talk. So they ordered speaking privileges in the meetings by your identity. So this woman applied it to her class and got in hot water, and she got in trouble. I don't remember exactly what happened, but she was told she can't do that, and it became a bit of a media kerfuffle. So we had the idea to just write a feminist philosophy paper in philosophy of education, arguing that that should be a way to teach students. And of course, we had to decide to take it over the top. Not only were we going to progressively stack the classroom and invite white and male students to listen and learn in silence, we decided that adding in experiential reparations, where the most privileged members of the class would be asked to, invited to, not asked to, invited to sit on the floor, maybe wearing chains, or would be intentionally spoken over when they would talk, so as to simulate what it'd be like to be a minority who or a woman who has to deal with that as a matter of course. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to get that one through the whole peer review process. But the reviewers really seemed to like it. They just thought the idea was right, but we hadn't quite got the scholarship tight enough. We hadn't quite got the idea articulated the way that they wanted it, but they thought it was a really great project that we were suggesting. And so we learned a lot about feminist epistemology and their application to education in that process.
On a quick side note, so the teacher that you were just telling us about, so I've heard people joke about like a so-called oppression hierarchy that is going around, but from what I just heard, if she's saying that the more oppressed you are, the more front of the line you get to go, I mean, that really is a, what did you call it, progressive stack? So
yeah, that's what they call it.
So progressive stack actually is pretty much an oppression hierarchy.
Yeah, so in intersectional thought, a scholar named Patricia Hill Collins in 1990, plus or minus a year or two, defined what's called the matrix of oppression. And so that's often where you start to see this oppression hierarchy come out. And there are actually methods that they use, and they actually are used in schools a lot. I know people who have had to do them. College students frequently tell me that they've had to play, for example, the step forward, step back game, where they will line up maybe in the classroom or maybe in a gymnasium or in a field. And the teacher will say, you know, if you're white, take 3 steps forward. If you're black, take 2 steps backwards. If you're indigenous, take 3 steps backwards. If your parents paid for you to be here, take a step forward. You know, all these different things, some of which are very blatant, like this is, if you're a woman, you know, take a step back. If you're trans, take like 105 steps back or whatever it is. And then sometimes they're more subtle, like, you know, in the neighborhood you grew up in, were you a member of the majority race or whatever? Step forward if yes or whatever. And so then what would happen is people would be staggered all over the field, and you're supposed to be able to visually see how privileged you are. And in some cases, what they say is, okay, I've even seen this. There's a YouTube video of this where the deal was they are at a starting line and at a race, and they're going to race across the field, and then they play this game first. So some people have to start way back. And then some people get to start way with a huge head start. And then it was like, I'm going to give whoever wins the race $100. And then they spread them all out with the progressive stacking and say, is this fair? And obviously everybody's like, it's not fair. But you can see where all of the stuff is just baked into the system. It's like, if you're black, take all these steps back. And, they're trying to work out this whole thing, but there's all of their ideologies just baked into how it's decided who's going to step forward, who's going to step back, and how much and whatever. And we suggested in the paper that that's how you, for example, could rank your students. And once the students are ranked, you get to decide whose emails you don't answer and whose emails do you answer first, and who gets extra credit and things like that. Who has to sit in the floor.
So, okay, so you guys wrote 20 of these papers that they're all like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were the overall results? I know some of them were published and whatnot. Overall, how
Sure.
many were published, and what happened?
Sure. So let's keep in mind that this is a very slow process to get these papers through, as we discussed. So by the time we were finished, 7 papers out of our 20 had been accepted. 4 of those had been published, of the ones that were accepted. Obviously, acceptance has to come before publication. So we had 7 accepted, 4 of which got published. We had 6 that we decided were crap, and we were just done with those. We weren't going to try to fix them, just let them go. They weren't going to work. That's fine. And that left 7 that were still somewhere in the process. Either we were editing them, or they were under peer review, or something like that. When the Wall Street Journal figured out what we were doing and forced us to go public about 6 months ahead of our anticipated schedule. That said, there was an argument. I always forget which newspaper it was in. There was an argument that was written up in a newspaper that was quite good by a scholar contending that the results that we had point out that it's very likely that we would have had at least 11 of our papers successfully accepted. My guess is that we probably would have, almost definitely would have got 12. We might have got 13. I don't think we would have got 14. And of course, it couldn't have been more than that because 6 we had already quit on out of the 20. So our results were pretty convincing that we know how to write papers to get them accepted in these journals. And had we had the time to see our experiment through, I think we would have seen anywhere between 11 and 13 of our papers accepted without us having written any more beyond the 20 to try to pad our numbers or anything. At this point, I think I could probably, with Helen's and Peter's help, the 3 of us certainly could write anywhere between 10 and 15 a year, and we'd have higher than a 95% acceptance rate. Almost every paper we write now would get in, a lot of them at significant journals. We're almost unstoppable if we wanted to do this.
Because you know what you need to say to give them what they want to hear.
Yeah. You start with the politically satisfying conclusion that they want to hear. You write it up in the way that they want to see it. You get all the T's crossed, the I's dotted. You use the scholarship that they're talking about correctly. You exaggerate some things to horrify the public when you tell them about it later. You put something absolutely absurd in there. It's like just making a cake at this point, and it's really easy to get these things in. And it's kind of scary because none of us have a background in this whatsoever. Helen's background is in medieval literature, and Peter is philosophy of education, and I'm in mathematics.
Can you talk about the comments that you got? Because you guys were successful at getting a lot of these papers either accepted or published. But from what I saw, I mean, you guys there was a lot of enthusiasm for your work as well.
In what way? You mean the peer reviewers? Do you mean?
Yeah, the peer reviewers.
Yeah, the peer reviewers. So occasionally we had 2 kinds of critical reviewers. One would be the kind who, well, 3, I guess. One would be the ones who would mostly point out the right reasons to reject our papers, sometimes quite rigorously, and sometimes in ways that were vaguely muddled with the ideology we were trying to expose. And I'm considering that kind of 2 categories, the really rigorous ones. We had, so for example, I want to give credit where it's due. We had a peer reviewer in one of our papers that said that we were abusing statistical language, and we can't be using statistical language in a qualitative study. And he was really strict about all the different, I don't know if it was a he or a she actually, but I think it was a he by the aggressiveness of the tone, but who knows. we have to be very strict about how we're using that language. And that person was exactly right. And I'm glad that, I mean, it made my life harder at the time, but I'm glad that that person was doing peer review for that journal. Then we had other people that were quite enthusiastic. We love this project. This is exactly the right kind of suggestion. This is an excellent contribution to feminist philosophy. This is an important contribution to knowledge. This is a sign of a truly marvelous paper. Wow, this paper is so innovative and rich in analysis and depth. It's just, the enthusiasm was really kind of frightening. I'm very sympathetic to this project because while we have had significant success at making inroads into the soft sciences such as psychology, sociology, and biology, we've had relatively little success into the hard sciences such as physics. Yeah. A lot of stuff like that. Even in the papers that didn't get through, I'm very sympathetic to the author's point, or I'm very sympathetic to this project. However, here are the flaws. There was a lot of enthusiasm from the peer reviewers. It was really alarming for us. I very rarely found reading the reviewers' comments, even though they were of that type, to be amusing. It was most often horrifying. The papers themselves, like where your producer was laughing about the dog park paper, it's hard for me to think of those and not laugh because we tried to make them funny on purpose. So our jokes are all throughout, but it was really kind of scary, the responses they gave us. Really, our papers got predominantly a warm welcome.
And they actually said in some of the comments, this is, what did you just say? The statistical analysis is great. Like they specifically said.
No, not the statistical analysis is great. So nobody said that because mostly we didn't do that. And in a couple of places we fudged it on purpose. We had one paper where we tried to pull off statistical language with qualitative studies, and a reviewer caught it and said, this is not appropriate. So that was good on their part. And then we had another paper where they said that the statistics, that they didn't understand them, and it would be better if we took the quantitative data out and relied entirely on narrative instead. And that was kind of horrifying. But they did say things about our papers like that it was rich analysis or very innovative, important contribution to feminist philosophy. And my favorite one of all is an important contribution to knowledge.
I saw that one too. Didn't you say that some of the feedback that you got back told you what to change or what to say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's typical. That's really the job that the peer reviewers have, is to recommend ways to strengthen the paper in addition to pointing out any of its flaws or weaknesses. So they tell us, oh, go cite this, or you need to make a point about that, or you need to tell how you respected the dogs while you inspected their genitals, or how you overcame the fact that you're a human and can't possibly know if a dog wanted to be humped or not. And please explain all of that. There's also a lot of cases where it would be, incorporate this reference or this particular theory. For example, in the paper about putting kids in the floor in chains, they told us that we shouldn't be relying. We thought when we wrote the paper, wow, this is over the top. Nobody's going to take this. It's just too cruel to the students. So we wrote in all this stuff about using what's called critically compassionate intellectualism. I don't even for sure know what that is, but something about being compassionate to the people that we're putting in the floor. We don't be mean to them, just give them this opportunity and try to make them feel okay about it. And they're like, no. You need to use Megan Buller's pedagogy of discomfort. And you need to study Barbara Applebaum's idea about recentering the needs of privileged students. So if you're too compassionate to them, they won't learn because you're not making them uncomfortable enough to overcome their own privilege. And if you try to address their needs or whatever, then you're recentering the privileged person's needs and ignoring the needs of oppressed people. And it was like, whoa. So we learned a lot about the way that they approach education by some of those suggestions, for example. And in every single paper, they would often suggest to us, some other scholars' work to look into. The dog humping paper, they suggested that we incorporate some of the stuff done by a scholar named Harlan Weaver, whose Ph.D. thesis, he's a trans person, I think, and his Ph.D. thesis is something along the lines of documenting his relationship with his pit bulls. And okay.
And didn't you say that you had you were invited to also become peer reviewers because they thought that your work was so amazing?
Yeah, well, at least one suggested that our previous work was good and they wanted us to. I know that there's a desperation for peer reviewers, so I don't want to read too much into why we were invited to be peer reviewers. But the fact is that we were invited to do that. So if we had wanted to go to that level and we decided it wasn't ethical to do that, we could have gone in and peer reviewed papers that other people wrote and just really screwed with the scholarly canon. We could have encouraged them to just put the most absurd stuff in there or most horrifying stuff or whatever and messed with their papers from the inside. But we decided that that wasn't an ethical part of the project. It was to see if we could get our own crazy sophistry validated as knowledge in the field. It wasn't to mess with the scholarly canon, which is something that we never had the intention of doing.
And you said that you guys were caught before you were planning on it. What happened? How did you guys get caught?
So our our friend was our undoing. So our project, if you recall, started kind of by us watching that Real Peer Review Twitter account that tweets us papers. Well, eventually, Real Peer Review got a hold of our dog park paper and tweeted it, making fun of it. And that got it some attention, and some journalists started writing about it. It was in the National Review. It was in a number of different outlets. And one journalist just wouldn't let the story go. It just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And she ultimately kept writing stories about it, and through a variety of means ended up where a journalist at the Wall Street Journal near the end of July of 2018 got interested in what was going on and doing a story about what appeared to be at that point was that the author that we had invented whole cloth was somebody who must be lying about her credentials. We made the mistake because when we made up our fake people, we made them up at the very beginning before we knew a whole lot about what we were doing. So we said that she had a Ph.D. in feminist studies. Well, it turns out that that's a pretty rare degree. And I think there are only 4 institutions in North America that give that degree. So it was pretty easy for the journalist to call all 4 of them and verify that no such person ever got a Ph.D. in that discipline from there. So all of a sudden it looked like somebody's lying about their credentials, and they tried to work this up into some kind of a story. And they called the academic journal that was involved, and they called the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal called the academic journal that was involved, and it all got kind of like in a big mess. And so the academic journal contacted us and asked us to prove our identity. And all of a sudden, the false identity, when you just put it into a form or whatever, is one thing. But when you actually have to create a fake ID and, really, I mean, there was a lot of commitment to that lie to continue. And that was never the intention of the thing. So we bailed out at that point, and rather than ignoring the Wall Street Journal and letting her write whatever story she wanted to write, I called her to give an interview. She thought she was going to be talking to a nervous feminist scholar, and then I told her what she had really run into. And so then the jig was up, and that story was coming public as soon as she could get something written about it.
So then what did you guys do at that point to kind of wrap up your experiment?
Panicked. Absolute freak out level panicking. Because we had anticipated having 6 more months to wrap up what we were doing, analyze what we had done, write it up cogently, and working with Mike Nana, who is a documentary filmmaker who's been recording us, but also who was working with us by that point, produce materials to communicate what we had done effectively to the public, knowing that it's really controversial and that first impression was going to matter. So we panicked and panicked some more, and for like a week in August last year, I pretty much didn't sleep, and it was just the level of stress was beyond anything I think I've ever experienced, because Mike's Australian, and he was stuck in Australia with a visa issue, and so he's making a documentary, and all of a sudden this thing's going public with or without him, it seemed. And it's like he can't even get to it's not like he could just get on a plane and like 24 hours later, he's here from Australia, and okay, it could have been worse. It's, we've legit got like 10 days to wait because his visa won't let him enter the country for 10 more days. And so, it's like, is this story going to happen? What happens next? We're trying to figure out ways to buy time. Then ultimately, Mike came. We started frantically writing the things to get them together. Jillian, who wrote the story for the Wall Street Journal, Jillian Melchior, needed more time to get her story together and understand what we had done than we anticipated. So we had a lot more flexibility than we thought. So Mike put out the video that I think everybody's seen now, the 7 or 8 minute clip where we told the world what we did. We wrote the piece, the 10,000 word piece for Aereo or whatever that is, and put that together. We put together a press kit so we would be able to tell the world. And we just hammered this together in 3 or 4 frantic weeks. All flew out to Portland to be in one place with Peter Boghossian because he had family and work obligations. So we all convened with him and we went public.
And what was that like? What were the reactions like?
Oh my gosh. So for 2 or 3 days, I don't even know that it can be described what it was like. After we went public on October 2nd, and I don't know that I knew what was happening clearly at any point until sometime on the 4th or the 5th. Calls for interviews incessantly, emails asking us for comments or interviews incessantly. My Twitter just locked up and broke a bunch of times to where I couldn't use the app on my phone because it would get so many notifications. It'd fill the cache and crash my phone. I mean, it actually would crash my phone. My phone would just stop working, and I would have to uninstall Twitter and put it back to make the phone work again repeatedly. I mean, it was just out of control for a few days. And, we're talking, it'd be, we'd roll from one interview to the next interview so fast we didn't know who we were talking to. All of a sudden I just have a phone in my hand talking to some woman. I have no idea who it is, and it's a reporter from the New York Times. And I'm just like, oh, that's who you are. Okay, whatever. And it's just one thing after another after another. And that story for the New York Times ended up on the front page of the paper on the 5th, and we didn't even know. We found out on Sunday the 7th that it had been on the front page of we made the front page of the New York Times and didn't even know because so much crazy stuff was going on. It was, as Pete likes to phrase it, absolute mayhem for about 3 or 4 days continuously. People were like, oh, you have to come be on our show, come to LA, come to New York, come to this, come to that. It's like, we can't be in like 8 places at once. What are you talking about? And reporters were coming to us or trying to meet us in Portland. And it was just absolutely crazy for about 3 or 4 days, just nonstop, not even sure when to sleep. We had made a pact to more or less stay off of Twitter so we didn't get sucked into that. And so we kind of looked at it and we retweeted some stuff, but we didn't engage with anything. It was really an odd time.
What were the reactions?
Very stressful.
What were the reactions? I guess, what were they saying? How did they feel? Did they agree? Do they hate what you guys were doing? Like what you were doing?
So they kind of were all over the map. There was a lot of excitement and support very early on. There was a lot of holy crap, what just happened kind of reactions. There were a lot of people trying to get a grasp on what was going on. It was way more confusion, I think, at first, and support than anything else, because it was almost a week or two, maybe even I think it was at least a full week, and really 2 before anything started up where there was any real criticism coming out, except just people commenting on Twitter that we were jerks or whatever. It really took them a little while to start to say negative stuff. And then even now, it's just been shocking how little negativity, other than the kind of easy to ignore stuff of, people on Twitter saying we're bad people or we're not serious or whatever. And then what has come out that's been critical has been just insults or attacks on our motivations. It's been very little good criticism, which I'm sort of bummed out about, because we did this very hodgepodge. It wasn't like we had a awesome master plan. We just had the XYZW that our critics had laid out and as a roadmap and kind of followed it. So there's a lot of space where we could have done things better. Some people thought, it would be better if you had set this up as a scientific experiment with control groups and things. But I don't think that that actually captures the essence of what we were trying to accomplish. And so it's like a good criticism that misses the mark of what we were doing and what we did and why we were doing it. Um, and some other people suggested, that we didn't have to be so offensive or, whatever it happens to be. But there's been a fairly strong bias toward just outright support. The reactions have been much more positive than negative, and the people we expected to come after us and be negative have been, for the most part, very quiet. A friend of mine who works in academia in a humanities department told me that his guess on the reason, based on all the conversations he has, and I'm not allowed to say who he is, he said, never tell anybody who I am, but the reason that this is because you got them and they know you got them. That's what he says. So I feel like there's been actually a lot of support, a lot of secret support too. I get emails still every day from people who either work in various sectors of academia or who work in all walks of life, really, who are thank us for what we're doing and say that they want to be able to say it but they can't.
So you got a lot of that. You got a lot of people saying that they felt the same way that you guys did, or that they agreed with your experiment, but that they feel like they can't say anything.
Thousands, all the way from, Ivy League through state colleges, through like big state schools, through, small schools, liberal arts colleges, like small liberal arts colleges, community colleges, people who work in industry, people who work in business, people who work in tech, people who have clubs, it's everywhere, people in media, everywhere. People are sending these notes. Thank you. People who work in medicine. That's the scary one for me. I wish I could speak up about this, but I have to keep my head down because XYZ, appreciate what you're doing. This is what's going on in my field. Don't tell anybody I told you this.
Doesn't I think is it Deborah So who talks about that? She's a sex scientist, and I think she's kind of blown up in the last year or so for having a scientific approach to gender and sex, and that's a hot button topic right now, and I think she's getting kind of a lot of flack for that, but she's a scientist, and I know that that's one of her just something she's dealing with right now.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually kind of the thing. That's sort of what I was referring to, and sort of what led us to want to do this. Or part of it is that we think that these topics need to be studied, and they need to be studied rigorously. What's going on with gender and sex is important. There are a lot of difficult questions that have a lot of socio-political and cultural importance and weight. And the thinking that we had is that if you approach those with naked ideology, or as one person from an elite college phrased it to us, forwarding just prejudice and opinion under the mask of being knowledge, rather than doing rigorous research with actual scientific methods, then anything you get right, as Sam Harris noted a long time ago about faith, you get right by accident. You have to have rigorous methods. You have to have skepticism and empiricism. You have to do the test, or it's very difficult to trust the information that you have in front of you. So we wanted to see those more rigorous methods. I want to see gender and sex studied scientifically and rigorously. I like the creativity and some of the insights that I learned that the people within these fields in the humanities have. And I wish that rather than using what they call a constructivist lens that denies that biology plays a role or a significant role, or as significant a role, depending on who it is. I'm not saying these, like, to qualify what I'm saying, these are three different distinct positions that the different people in these fields like gender studies have. Either that biology doesn't play a role, or doesn't play much of a role, or it plays some role, but it plays significantly less of a role than in reality that it does. You very rarely find one who admits that biology is significant, in determining things about sex and then gender. I think that when you leave the conversation just to them and what they're saying, and you ignore the science, that you've got a major problem. And what you're going to get is stuff that, like I said, is at best right by accident, and at worst actually hurts the people you're trying to help. And I wish that the creative insights that they have would, instead of being forwarded as prejudice and opinion, would get brought back and tested rigorously. If you want to put forth an idea about toxic masculinity, let's talk about it. Maybe there is some kinds of stuff that works out as toxic masculinity. Maybe the name's not a very good name, but let's be very rigorous and very clear about what it is. Let's not just use it as a whip that every time some guy does something you don't like, now it's toxic masculinity.
So how do you think it was even possible for this to happen? I mean, what's going on? What is the problem in, I mean, you guys, all of your papers were targeted at the humanities. So, I mean, specifically with this field of study, why was it that your work was able to get through so easily?
So the answer is if I want to give a fair answer, it's a little bit complicated, but the simple kind of summary of it would be that these disciplines, gender studies, critical race theory, etc., queer theory, you can go on and list all the cultural studies. These disciplines are, and I hesitate, I shouldn't use the word disciplines because discipline is lacking. These fields are ones that exist within the humanities that do not have rigorous methodologies, that have a overwhelming political bias and very, very simplistic means for producing knowledge that is very easy to replicate and exploit. And since they don't rely on rigorous methodologies to draw their conclusions, they just rely on what works out to be kind of sloppy and circular arguments, it's pretty easy to create those and mimic what they're doing. Another way to phrase it would be at the peer review level, you expect peer reviewers are going to have rigor and, so I have a friend who's a scientist. He submits a paper, and the stuff that comes back to him is, did you use this kind of a test when you gathered data? Did you do this? Did you reduce it that way or this way? Did you consider using whatever alpha reductase, words nobody knows? Did you do all very rigorous stuff? And I think you should reanalyze your data using this, and you should control for that, and blah blah blah. You get this very rigorous stuff that actually tightens the thing up, and all of that rigor that we all expect and have not only expect, we see in the sciences is not present because these fields are ultimately operating within the humanities, and instead you have this. They call it a matrix of oppression. I say it's a kind of like network of offense-based rules that you just kind of have to navigate the minefield and not piss off the wrong people or say the wrong thing. And as long as the conclusion squares with the political ideology and you've got enough scholarship to look like you know what you're talking about, that's all it takes.
Can you talk about critical constructivism? I know you guys write about that in your kind of conclusion paper, and it's kind of convoluted, right? Yeah.
So we called all this stuff grievance studies. That's a very handy term because it's cultural studies that focus on grievance. That's the short reason for why we use that term, and social grievances. A more appropriate term for this approach to doing things would be what we're now calling applied postmodernism, and there are reasons for that. And then what does that really mean? Ultimately, it's a set of fields, methods, and approaches that rely on a lens that's called critical constructivism. So there are two words to that. And when you understand the two words, it's really not as scary an academic term as it sounds. Constructivism is the idea that things are social constructions, that everything's made out of, it's all socially constructed. So your sex, for example, is socially constructed. People tell you what you're supposed to be a woman, and therefore that's what you made yourself. That's the idea of social constructions. So the society and people within it are everything that we have is constructed by the way people are socialized and socialize with one another and the ideologies that are in play. And critical means complaining about power dynamics. And that's not an exaggeration. That is not a caricature. The point of critical in the context that it's meant here, it's not the same critical as you have in critical thinking. It's not the same critical that you have in critical mass. Critical thinking, is like to apply skepticism. Critical mass means there's a sufficient amount to where something, in this case, a nuclear chain reaction happens. In this case, critical means complaining about power dynamics. Critical means to look at the existing systems and structures in society, so as to identify the power dynamics and to critically evaluate them so as to make them more visible with the objective of creating political change around them. That's what critical means. So the critical constructivism as grievance studies contains an assumption that is constructivist thought. The constructivist theory is the only way to understand the world, and critical, which is that this interpretive lens or this interpretive approach and political agenda is the only way to properly interpret what's going on.
And you were saying that this
I
is
know
essentially what's
it's like,
going
whoa.
on. But you were saying that this is essentially what's going on in grievance studies?
Yes, it's not perfect, but grievance studies and applied postmodernism and critical constructivism are nearly synonyms. Just critical constructivism is the prevailing interpretation or interpretive view and approach that grievance studies uses. Grievance studies is a moniker that we said, okay, you have cultural studies that's focused on social grievances. Boom, grievance studies. And applied postmodernism is actually probably, in my opinion, the best description for what's really going on. It's not as cut to the chase as critical constructivism, but it is more accessible because that's what postmodernism did. Is it deconstructed things and tried to do so in a way that was consistent with what's called postmodern critical theory, which some people deny exists, but it doesn't. It does exist, I should say. Those people are wrong. The postmodern approach is to look at society as a system of power dynamics and socializing forces that creates unfairness. And the point of that is to deconstruct those and ultimately to criticize them and to make the structural problems more visible so that they can be politically remedied. Applied postmodernism is how it changed from the Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard. These are the big deconstructionist postmodern philosophers, the French postmodernists who ruined everything, so to say. They just wanted to take things apart and play with ideas and take everything down to its to where nothing makes sense. But in the 80s and 90s, largely you see it a little bit in gender and queer theory, but you also see it very specifically in critical race theory. You started to see this development where scholars realized that if they wanted to make a difference, if they wanted to achieve change, that they had to start admitting that things were real, which the original postmodernists were trying to deconstruct. And so they admitted that oppression based on identity and the power structures in society that create that oppression are real. And now we can apply that postmodern deconstructive and critical theory to make those problems visible and change them. And that's what we see going on. So, I mean, it's a lot of terminology. That's the dorky side of what we did. Dog humping is more accessible.
So how it seems to me that this field of study is expanding. It's becoming more mainstream. Why do you think that is? Why is it catching on so I guess widespread?
I have a not mainstream view of why I think it's starting to become mainstream. And it is. It's mainstreaming pretty rapidly. There's a few things going on. Helen, I'll point out, believes, and I think correctly, that part of what's happening now is that the people who are invested in this view very, very strongly have become overconfident and are showing their hand too early. They think that they have more power and more say than they actually do, and they're showing their tendencies and their true beliefs openly more than they ever have. And they're doing it before it's going to work. And so things are actually shifting back the other direction away from them. And I think that's correct. I think that it started to really blossom. If you want my honest interpretation, during the Obama administration, there's a lot of things geopolitically that were going on leading into that and then through that time. This is a not mainstream view, and I don't really like to get too much into this, but what the hell. So you had the death of neoconservative politics as George Bush's economy collapsed, and the crises with the wars in Iraq and the Middle East. And so you have this distrust of the prevailing political paradigm. You have Obama come in, he's pushing hope and change. You have the failing neoconservatives in Congress, and then being flanked by these angry Tea Party people who decided that the way to go was, in the words of Mitch McConnell, to make Obama a one-term president, basically by doing whatever. What I watched during those 8 years that Obama was president was I watched a lot of people on the left get more and more pissed off that the Republicans were cheating. And as my studies into the psychology of religion and psychology of authoritarianism go, when you start to feel out of control, you start to act in ways that aren't normal. So one of the things you start looking for is a ready explanation for what's going on and for something you can do about it, to understand and then to exert control. It's all based in a crisis of control. So where you had the hardlining Republicans spending 8 years of resisting everything Obama did, I mean, threatening to shut down the government, shutting down the government, threatening to default on our debt, all these crazy things that were portrayed in the media, whether rightly or wrongly, as being existential crises. And then Obama not being able to achieve the progressive agenda to the degree that many of his supporters thought they would be able to. You saw a crisis of control arise on the left, particularly on the far left, and they searched for an explanation, and critical race theory and critical gender theory were there saying we live in a patriarchal, white supremacist, cis hetero tyranny that is run by a bunch of old white men who want to control the world and oppress people and maintain and press their own power and advantage. And it fit. It was enough of a fit. I don't think it's right, don't get me wrong, but it was enough of a fit for people who were desperate to understand what was going on to latch onto it. And then in 2015, you had these highly publicized shootings of black teenagers by police. Whether those were justified or not is irrelevant to the image that sent to people who were glomming onto this. We live in a racist society where white people want to maintain the control that they're losing. And boom, there it went. The explanation spread like wildfire, and a whole lot of people in utter desperation clung to it. Then what happens in 2016? We elected the freaking avatar of these ideas, and for the people who buy into that theory, confirmed every single one of their worst fears about society. So now they're just absolutely going nuts, and they feel utterly out of control. So they're looking for ways to understand. So they turn to theory and regain control through actions. They turn to activism that's consistent with that theory. I think that's why this has blown up.
Do you think social media has played a role in the spread?
Totally. There's other aspects to it than just that. For example, the ability to network on social media has enabled, if you've read Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning's paper and book about the rise of victimhood culture, for example.
We actually had Bradley Campbell on as well.
Yeah. So then you have the idea. So basically, the internet enables that to a degree that I don't think other information paradigms allow. Social media allows people to find people they agree with. They allows people to be exposed to what seems to be homogenous opinions from people that they like and respect, while getting a steady diet of stuff that freaks them out and radicalizes them from people that they hate, whether that's people that are being hate shared or they're finding out that their neighbor has these crazy, awful, regressive views or terrible progressive ideas and whatever, and everybody starts hating each other. So social media definitely has created the environment in which this could happen and poured copious amounts of jet fuel on it so that it would burn hotter and angrier than ever. So certainly social media has played a role. I don't think it's as simplistic as to say, oh, well, social media happened, therefore all this stuff crapped out. I think that there were other forces that go on in addition to that. But I'll admit that, I did spend a lot of time reading about the psychology of control. And so I do see it maybe more brightly than is warranted.
So what do you think? I know it's hard to make predictions, but what do you think is going to happen at this point? Because like you just laid out with, I think, President Trump, the timing that it happened, everyone seems to be, just kind of losing it. Everyone kind of seems to be staying in their echo chambers and social media, and now probably outside of that as well. You say this formed this perfect storm. So what do you think happens now?
I think actually it is starting to change. I think the wind has changed with regard to some of those forces. People are sick of this state of affairs, and I'm seeing more and more people who are ready to drop the politics and reach across the aisle and be friends with people, regardless of their politics or their religion. I see more and more people who are recognizing the toxic influence that being so-called too online carries with it, right? It's a fascinating thing that term has come about now, right? Too online as a way to describe people who spend too much time online and have skewed thinking as a result. And so there's this kind of organic movement pushing back away from that. As to what's going to happen, I don't know. I think Nicholas Christakis and John Haidt both are pretty convinced that a lot rides on what happens in the 2020 election. If Trump gets reelected, for example, or even if he's impeached and Pence is elected, versus whether some intersectional feminist gets elected, versus whether some mainstream person, Republican or Democrat, gets elected. What kind of class comes into the Congress? I mean, these things are going to have profound effects because right now people are so hyper attuned to politics and trying to analyze what politics mean for their lives. It'll have profound and difficult to predict effects. But at the same time, I see that the cultural wind has shifted. People don't like this contentious, polarized state of affairs and are organically trying to take steps that should mitigate the worst of it. And I think that we will see those things continuing to grow, although it's hard to say depending on what happens, how contentious this forthcoming election cycle gets. I like to see people reaching across the table and deciding to put their political and religious differences aside and try to, whether they talk about issues or not, to establish the relationships, the baseline relationships that we see one another as human, regardless of our people with values similar to our own and members of our community, friends, neighbors. That we have that baseline first, regardless of political ideology or religious beliefs or morals or whatever. I think that that's the first big step, and I'm seeing that happen very rapidly over the past few months.
I'm really glad you said that because we felt like we were seeing or at least feeling the same thing, feeling the same desire and almost desperation for civility and respect, not agreement, just respect. And I mean, that's really the entire foundation of our show. And we have been so, we're still fairly new, but so far we have been so pleasantly surprised at how respectful and enthusiastic our audience is. I think, we try really hard to cultivate an environment that doesn't, that's not very, that doesn't call for like trollish behavior and a lot of negativity and a lot of fighting. That's just not what we're about. And we feel like our audience gets that. And we're so excited to see that. And again, we didn't know if we were right. We're like, for all we know, everyone likes the fighting. They like the, being in their own, the tribalism and all that. But I
think they did 5 years ago.
I wouldn't disagree. I think when you're, at least in my experience and a lot of people I talk to, I think when you kind of start joining the fight, which arguably a lot of people did with the rise of social media and the crazy last election and all that, I think a lot of people joined these fights and sensitive topics that they normally probably wouldn't have been as into, but their friends were into it and celebrities are into it. Everyone on social media is into it. So, hey, why not? I'll get into it too. It's exciting. It's, you're in it with your friends or your group, whatever. But then after a while, I mean, for at least some of us, like myself, like it just gets old and you start seeing real life consequences, whether it's like losing friends or family members, whatever it is, like it gets too much. And I hope you're right that a lot of other people are sensing this too. It's just become too much.
I think that's what's going on. It's definitely like it's really heavy. You start to see the consequences. It's exhausting. It's kind of embarrassing, to look back and think, did I just spend 5 years of my life mostly sitting on a computer instead of like ever going outside and yelling at strangers and things? And as you said, there's another sense to it too. It's just boring. It's like, oh wow, you're just going to say everybody's just saying the same kind of stuff. It's like who posts their political stuff on Facebook now? It's either pages that are trying to promote that brand or pundits or like that crazy uncle that never gets it. Everybody else has just been like moved on from that. Nobody does that stuff anymore, and it's losing popularity rather than gaining it. Twitter is a little bit more toxic, but even there you're seeing norms and rules, even like within like political people Twitter, to where it's I don't think it's an accelerating problem. I think people are figuring out that it's not worth the constant tension, and that there's other aspects to life, and the self-righteous rage that they got to feel, and the in-group partisan social identity that they gained. Social identity theory is really worth looking into on tribal behavior. It wasn't worth the cost. It's too exhausting, and it's ultimately just a bunch of boring, predictable behavior. And people are looking for different stuff, and I hope what they're looking for is that building that network of community ahead of other agendas more than anything else. Agreeing or disagreeing is secondary. It's even having conversation about difficult topics is secondary to building that network of community and friendship and respect and humanity. I think that's the first thing, and that's what people are craving most.
Yeah, some of our favorite things are to watch some of our commenters without we don't interject too much if there's like a discussion on one of our episodes or something really going. We don't really interject, but one of our favorite things is to watch commenters respond to another commenter who is just super like toxic and trolling. They're contributing nothing to the conversation, and for them to call them out and be like, but what's your point about the facts, or like why are you being so rude, and why are you making personal attacks? And so it's like they're kind of I don't know, it's nice. They're essentially saying what we're trying to do, which is really nice to see.
Yeah, that stuff used to get a lot of reward, and I don't think it's as socially accepted anymore, and that's progress.
I hope not. I did want to ask you about a little bit more about the inside of academia. While I have you, because you guys did this experiment where you went deep into it, and you guys work in academia outside of it, or at least you used to. We were talking about how you were able to even pull this experiment off in the first place. I wanted to ask you about the significance of getting your work published as a researcher. Like, what you talked about this in your conclusion paper, and I thought it was a really interesting thing to talk about. Are you able to speak about that and why it's so important?
You mean what we did? Why it's so important?
Or rather, why it's so important for careers?
Why it's so important as an academic to have this kind of research, work being published. As a former educator and researcher, I feel like to really be on top of what's going on, to really be able to communicate to your students, for example, if you're thinking of teaching as a primary job, and it is a primary job of university faculty, you've got to be in touch with what your field is doing. You've got to stay doing it so that you stay sharp on the details, sharp on the skills, sharp on the fundamentals. And you also have to keep that enthusiasm that comes with making new discoveries and digging and being interested in and passionate about something, to communicate that to your students as well. As researchers, I feel like it's important to always be pushing the frontiers of human knowledge, because you never know what the next important discovery is. You can say, oh, well, it's a theory of relativity, for example. That's one that gets a lot of press as a big idea. It was a paradigm change in physics. The theory of relativity was huge. Einstein was huge. And so he was. And Einstein admits that his greatest inspiration that led to the questions that led to him formulating relativity theory came from Faraday's work, in particular, one aspect of Faraday's work. And so, Faraday did a lot of important constructive and valuable work on electricity and magnetism, but it wasn't necessarily clear that he was going to institute, be the domino before the domino that caused a paradigm change in all of physics. And so it's always important to be digging in to try to find the true nature of reality, to find out the most accurate answers to the questions that we have, and to formulate the most interesting and relevant questions about what we don't know that you can ask. And that requires people to be constantly doing this. As far as for their careers go, I mean, that's the high level, the high-minded version. I actually think that research requirements, like the publish or perish, as it's called, thing where if you don't get enough papers published, you can't get tenure or you won't be hireable. I think that actually is probably a bit of an error in the degree to which is emphasized in academic hiring and careerism, because it encourages people to focus on the wrong things for their careers, which is getting more papers out there, whether those are high or low quality, or to cheat to get papers, or to neglect other aspects of their professional development, or to overwork. I think there are a lot, and to create a situation in which the academic journals themselves hold so much power that you can start to proliferate journals that are filled with bogus nonsense just because people need more journals to publish in and people want to publish things. And there's a whole network there where I think that as far as for the careers, there are excellent reasons for doing it. And it's not a terrible measurement of somebody's efficacy, both as a researcher and their value, thus their value to a research community, and as an educator and their value there. But I do think it's overemphasized in hiring decisions but given the demands of the situation, where you may often have over 200 applicants for a single academic position, I understand that you have to have some means that's relatively efficient. You can't bring everybody in and spend a week with them getting to know them or whatever to vet who's going to be the best academic to hire if there are 200 applicants. So it's a very complicated and difficult problem that I think is connected to the heart of why we see things like this happening, but also that remains important for what it means to be a successful academic in pretty much everything academics do.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you say that you think it could incentivize people to, I guess, contribute to echo chambers, meaning in reference to your experiment in the humanities?
Sure. So in a good example, I just recently got asked to read and review a book on critical dietetics and critical nutrition studies. Again, we remind everybody what critical means. It means complaining about power dynamics. And so in the book, they talk about the need for critical dietetics and the need for the field to exist is partially based upon, they said, well, we submitted our critical dietetics and critical nutrition studies papers to dietetics and nutrition journals, and they rejected them and said that they don't have anything to do with dietetics, they don't have anything to do with nutrition or the study of nutrition. And therefore, we created our own journal, Critical Dietetics. Or maybe in another dimension, not too far away, it was we created our own journal, Fat Studies, or whatever, Gender, Place, and Culture, critical race and education. It's like, okay, so you start to cook up your own journals to study your niche topics. And those niche topics are, with critical dietetics, for example, completely invested in pushing the critical lens. That's all they're there for. That's what they exist to do. And so, if that gets picked up by some kind of a publisher or whatever, or if that can be used to academically credential somebody. So let's say that I wanted to be a dietitian and I sucked at dietetics. And so I wanted to complain about, because that's in their book too, about They often got excluded from professional things, and it couldn't possibly be because they were trying to advocate weird holistic methods, but rather because they somehow were discriminated against. So I didn't make it, and I want to complain about it, and I start to publish in critical dietetics journals, and then I apply for a job and say, well, I have 8 published papers. Granted, the hiring committees aren't naive. They look at what journals you've published in, and those are ranked in various ways, and that's all not perfect. But nonetheless, a published paper can count as a published paper, and depending on what field you're going into or what you're trying to accomplish, you can actually advance your own career by publishing in these kinds of journals. Now, in this case, what happened was, as I said, this stuff started anywhere, depending on how you want to measure it, between 50 and 30 years ago, the stuff that we were examining, the grievance studies, and they have their own journals that are kind of this like weird breakout that's no longer really part of the humanities in the sense of what the humanities have always seemed to seek to do. And they're not social sciences because they don't quite qualify. So they made their own journals. And I said that the Academy never did anything to put a stop to that. But one thing they could have done to put a stop to it is say, oh, well, that's nice. You have a paper in, fat studies, but that doesn't count toward hiring or promotion or tenure. That's a made up journal. If you guys want to study it, that's fine. But it's not a journal that carries any real weight. And that could have helped sort out some of the problems. Of course, they would have complained about that too in their journal. But there is this issue there where when we look at these journals and how they're ranked and how they're taken, there's this kind of assumption that they're not all equal, but they all carry some kind of academic status, and there seems to be very little being done successfully to deal with that problem. So say if you work in I don't know, you work in gender studies and you publish all your papers in gender studies journals, well, that's good for you. But if somebody outside looks at this and says, oh, well, gender studies, is just advancing a critical constructivist view, and so it's really just bad philosophy, and there's no reason to take that seriously. In your own field, in your own department, which is at home within the university, you totally get to advance, and eventually you can get tenure, and the people who make those decisions are people within your department, by and large, and some administrators who may or may not know what the details are and may not care. And so you have this kind of a problem where if you can cook up your own journal and then you can count the papers that you've published in that journal toward your career, that you can advance echo chamber type stuff. That's certainly an issue. Yeah.
Do you know, so these journals you're talking about in grievance studies and kind of these, I guess, sub-discipline fields or whatnot. Do you know how often they would or do publish work that kind of goes against the typical narrative for, let's just say fat studies? Like, do you think a journal
Sure.
like this would in fact publish a paper that says fat study, like a criticism of fat studies, I guess?
Okay, so this is complicated, and I'm going to get myself in trouble if I'm not really, really careful. So 2 things to say. One is it varies depending on the journal. Some are more rigorous than others. They also tend to be ranked more highly and are often more interdisciplinary when they're more rigorous. Then, would it publish a criticism of itself? Yes and no. So yes, it would, as long as it's still consistent with the overarching theory. What you will not find is that it publishes a criticism of the overarching theory unless it pushes itself further into the critical constructivist lens. You will not find something in fat studies that questions whether or not there are power dynamics in society that disadvantage fat people. You will only find ones that question whether or not fat studies is doing enough to care about, say, the way that being fat intersects with being black, or the way that being fat intersects with being lesbian and Latina, or something like that. You will not find it questioning the overarching theory and saying that there's a problem there. That would be seen as problematic, and they would not publish something problematic. How could you know this? Well, they published that transracial argument that Rebecca Tavell, Hypatia, one of the biggest feminist philosophy journals, published an argument about transracialism saying that basically, if people want to claim that they're transracial and people want to claim that they're transgender, that the arguments for each are isomorphic to one another. So this is an open question that people who care about this should be worried about. And then the outcry, so Hypatia accepted and published that, and then the outcry was bonkers. And Rebecca Tuvel was getting threats, and Rebecca Tuvel was getting denounced by her former collaborators, and Hypatia had a civil war, and it almost collapsed as a journal, and it had all new management afterwards over fighting over this and then whether the paper should be retracted or not. And so if you go against the theory or you go against the offense-based rules network, then you're going to find yourself having problems. And in the future, you're going to find people being more cautious not to violate or transgress those boundaries, if you will. So no, you won't find a criticism that questions the underlying assumptions. You will, unless the criticism is in a way that makes it more in line with or more deep in the weeds of the kind of complaining about power dynamic structure. That underlying assumption is not to be questioned. But within that, there's tons of room to criticize itself in terms of making itself more politically active and or nuts.
So you're saying it's pretty one-sided.
The phrase that I've used, I'll just say yes, but the phrase that I've used is the wind there only blows in one direction, and it's a gale.
It's what?
It's a gale. It's a hard, strong storm raging wind.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's a gale.
Like I mentioned earlier, we did have on Bradley Campbell. We also had on Coleman Hughes, and they both
he's good.
They both mentioned the ratio between, to put it simply, like left-leaning to right-leaning faculty and staff on college campuses. Do you by chance know what the current ratio is?
No, I was actually looking into it on Easter, and it varies heavily by field. What I was seeing there, and of course these are not very granular pieces of data, and I couldn't cite them, so it's really dodgy to talk about it too much, was that depending on the field, it ranges anywhere from, I think engineering was the least biased, and it was pretty close to parity. But once you got out of engineering, it was a slight left bias in engineering, but a slight. And then once you get out of engineering, it starts at about 4 or 5 or 6 to 1, and then goes up to, within most disciplines, it would be something like, upward at the upper end would be 20 to 25 to 1. And then in a couple of disciplines, and I don't remember what they were, it was like 58 to 0, as in we sampled 6,000 faculty members and found 0 conservatives, or whatever. And I don't know how they came up with a ratio to 0. As a mathematician, I was aghast, but I'll let it be. There were a couple that were like that. And then the big controversy that recently happened at Sarah Lawrence was based on on the fact that one of the faculty members published an article in the New York Times based on his, I think, research that said that the administrators are even more left biased on average than the faculty. And the faculty left bias is pretty pronounced. In the social sciences and humanities in particular, it's way up like 20 plus or 10 to 20 to 1, depending on the field. And it's worse with administrators overall. And so what happened was that the students at Sarah Lawrence then decided that that was problematic, that he admitted that fact, and that they wanted him fired from his job and all kinds of crazy stuff. And the campus almost went full evergreen and had a total meltdown, but I don't think that came to pass yet.
It's funny. I was just looking at something today saying that Evergreen is doing quite badly. That could be wrong. I don't want to say that if it's not.
Oh yeah, it's doing quite badly. Whether or not it will survive as an institution is a very open question right now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, so James, what do you hope happens as a result of your experiment? What you guys did?
So our actual hope was that we would create a situation in which more people inside and outside of the academy would feel like they have a license to say that they're not going along with the institutionalization of these ideas. Diversity, equity, and inclusion boards should be questioned in terms of their underlying assumptions, for example. whether diversity, equity, and inclusion pedagogy or educational theory should be kind of the standard, should be questioned, and the assumptions that that's based on should be questioned, because the scholarship that a lot of that rests on, which is what we were infiltrating and blowing the whistle on, I think should be in a crisis of confidence. I would ultimately like to see those academic disciplines start to reform so that the academy can recover itself. But more importantly, I would really like to see people at large, and especially academics among them, feel safe and encouraged to speak out against this stuff where it's claiming and seizing and executing power, where the justification for that is probably not where it needs to be. So I would like to see a shift in our cultural, and particularly the culture within academia, our attitudes toward, issues of social justice, to where we say things like, yeah, I believe that there are issues regarding sex, race, sexuality, gender, etc., and I think that they're important, but I want to see them studied rigorously. I don't want gender theory informing me of this. I don't want the constant complaining. I want to see real work being done. And I want to see sociological rigor behind things before we use it to make policy decisions or institutionalize anything. And if you're going to bully me by saying to check my privilege, I don't have to listen to you, and have a good day.
So what do you and Peter and Helen have next for this experiment, or what, you personally, what do you have coming up next?
We're actually at the moment starting to try to organize ourselves and build at least a website, possibly a foundation around which we'll be able to continue doing the work that we're doing. We're particularly interested in the kind of three things that we've been doing that we're kind of coalescing around are that we are continuing to try to point out the flaws in what we call grievance studies or applied postmodernism, to kind of take apart its power and its so-called justification. And we're trying to explain to people what it is and how it happened and why it matters. And then we're also trying to help people articulate alternatives. I think there's a huge need right now for people to understand, people who care about issues that are relevant to, say, social justice, to understand how to do those without having to succumb to social justice warrior type methods, as they get called, the authoritarianism, the kind of gender theory or race theory or whatever based assumptions, the constant identity salience raising things where people bring up, oh, we have to talk about your race. Oh, we have to talk about your sex. Oh, you're a woman, so this. Oh, you're a man, so that. And it's like, stop bringing it up. There's got to be an alternative to theirs. The universal liberalism, humanist ethics, or whatever they happen to be. We want to start articulating, how can I be a person who cares about a liberal society and is concerned about the issues that social justice wants to look at without becoming a problem or becoming, falling off the wagon into this kind of nonsense that's not based in reality. So that's what's next, is building that and putting that out in the world. And it should be coming fairly soon.
So are you guys going through with the documentary that you mentioned before?
Yeah, the documentary is still in the works. Mike Nana is building that. He'll probably start leaking out stuff about it sooner or later, probably sooner than later, on his YouTube channel. It's Mike Nana, Nayna, on the YouTube, and you can go find it there. The documentary we're hoping or anticipating will be done by the end of the year and start coming out, and I don't know, hopefully as big a release as possible. So that's definitely in the works, and people should keep an eye for it. It's certainly part of what we're up to.
All right. Well, Jim, is there anything else that you want to say or talk about that you feel like we didn't cover?
No, I think we did a pretty good job. Nothing's jumping out, so I appreciate that.
Okay,
good interview.
Great. Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for coming on and breaking all of this down for us. It doesn't sound like it's over, so we'll definitely have to get an update from you soon. But this was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Hey everyone! Thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.